Uncertainties are everywhere, whether it's climate change, financial volatility, pandemic outbreaks, or new technologies. We don't know what the future will hold. For many contemporary challenges, navigating uncertainty, where we cannot predict what may happen, is essential. But how is this done, and what can we learn from different contexts about responding to and living with uncertainty? In this podcast, IDEAS Research Fellow Shilpi Shrivastava is in conversation with Professor Ian Scoones, who argues that we need to adjust our modernist controlling view and to develop new approaches, including some reclaimed and adapted from previous times or different cultures. This requires a radical rethinking of policies, institutions, and practices for successfully navigating uncertainties in an increasingly turbulent world.
Hello everybody, welcome to this fresh episode of IDS's Between the Lines podcast. I'm Dr. Shilpi Shrivastava, Research Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. I'm joined by Professor Ian Scoones, also at IDS, who's going to talk about his new book, Navigating Uncertainty, Radical Rethinking in a Turbulent World. A very timely publication given the context and times that we're living in, and the book speaks directly to some of the most pressing challenges in the world today, from climate change to pandemics and financial uncertainties to technology regulation. It makes the case for moving away from a risk-based, modernist paradigm of control to a more emancipatory, iterative, deliberative, and socially embedded system of care and reliability. It carefully lays out these arguments through accounts of real people in different parts of the world who are navigating uncertainty and trying to generate reliability. Ian, first of all, congratulations for this amazing book.
Thank you very much.
So rich and one of the best accounts on uncertainty that I've read so far. With this, I welcome you to this podcast, and it's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Shilpi.
Thank you, Ian. So before we start, maybe you can tell us a little more about how this book project came about. Essentially, the journey of this book, which you say in your preface of the book, is your journey of over 40 years. So your career so far, which has been both fascinating and inspiring and amazing.
Well, that's very kind of you. And yes, it was a long time in coming. I don't think I planned to write a book on this 40 years ago, but there were a variety of things that happened over time. I originally trained as a natural scientist, as a biologist, and was always interested in not the way that natural science often teaches you to think in a very linear and mechanistic type way, but in the field of ecology, which was all about complexity, variability, systems, and so on. Because in ecology, the simple models just don't work. We have to think about them in complex systems in different ways. So right from that time, I was interested in these sort of themes, not conceptualized in this sort of way, but in these sort of themes. And I started working on rangeland ecology, grassland systems, livestock systems, as part of my PhD, where again, you confronted continuously these ideas like carrying capacity and stocking rates, which were all about management, control, keeping stability, and so on. Whereas actually the realities were so different. So that's when these ideas about non-equilibrium ecology and the new ecology, so-called, came about. And it was actually 30 years ago this year that I edited a book called Living with Uncertainty, surprise, surprise.
Yes.
So since then, I guess this word uncertainty has been in the vocabulary of my research work, and particularly this disconnect between standard modernist visions of control and stability as against the more open, complex systems and grounded forms of uncertainty. And the sort of field work I've done in different parts of the world, but particularly in Southern Africa and particularly in Zimbabwe since the mid-1980s, has provided just a lot of field level experiences, and they come into the book actually quite a lot. And the conceptual ideas, which always have to go with field work for me, because that's how I learn, were particularly developed in the STEP Centre, which was a Sussex-based centre, collaboration between IDS and Sprue here at Sussex, and particularly a very productive interaction between science and technology studies, science policy thinking, and development studies. And it was that where we got engaged together with colleagues at Sprue, particularly Andy Sterling, with these wider debates about a constructivist notion of knowledge and the idea of uncertainty as being uncertain knowledge, and so with its own politics. And I guess that's the long journey that ended up in prompting me to write this book as part of the European Research Council grant Pastres, which was on pastoralism, uncertainty and resilience. Global Lessons from the Margins is the subtitle of the project, and that's really what this is about, learning lessons from different places, different people, for some of these big global issues that you mentioned.
Great, that's fascinating, Ian, because it's just not the culmination of one project, but a series of projects and endeavors and your entire research trajectory, and that comes out very beautifully in the book, because it's not just examples from one place, one site, as we often have, or just one particular topic or sector, but a series of sectors and domains that you've captured in the book. In the introduction, and actually also what you said just before this, you draw out very clearly, there's a contrast in the book, and it is really at the heart of the argument that you're making, risk versus uncertainty. Accuracy/prediction versus reliability. And in all the chapters, starting from the introduction down to the conclusion, you're always urging your readers do not fall into the trap of risk or control, because this can land us in problems. So just for our listeners, can you distinguish between risk and uncertainty? Like, how are they different from each other, and what are the real dangers of falling into this trap?
So I think there's a really important distinction that's laid out in the book, which sometimes is confused, but I think it's a distinction that's worth making. And again comes from this wider work on risk and uncertainty that we developed as part of the STEP Centre, building on work from way back in the 1990s. So in this understanding, risk is essentially those conditions whereby knowledge about the likelihoods of outcomes are known or can be predicted or can be calculated, and knowledge about outcomes are also known and can be predicted. So, I mean, there are a whole array of circumstances where that's perfectly applicable, and you want it to be applicable. If you're building a bridge, if you're building a highway or something like that, engineers want to have some probabilistic analyses of the likelihoods of certain catastrophic outcomes in their design. Fine. But there are a huge array of circumstances, I would say probably most circumstances that we deal with in public policy and certainly in development, where even if we know the outcomes, the possible array of different outcomes, the likelihoods of where they will happen, what will happen, and so on, are not known, or can't be predicted and can't be safely modelled. So the danger, and that's uncertainty, and there are other different types of uncertainty. I mean, the most extreme form is ignorance. Some people call it radical uncertainty, where we don't know what we don't know. We don't know either the likelihoods of the outcomes or even the outcomes. So these are the black swan events that come from nowhere. So these categories of uncertainty are so common, whether we're talking about climate change or disasters or pandemics and so on. I mean, we really don't know. We can't model. We can't specify the likelihoods of outcomes. And if we pretend we do, if through sort of hubristic sets of assumptions we end up making claims about the likelihoods of these outcomes, and actually there's no basis for that, then that's quite dangerous. It can be really problematic, and quite a lot of the examples in the book are examples where in this language, we close down to risk, i.e. we make assumptions that we think it's risk when in fact it's uncertainty. And the argument is that actually opening up to uncertainty, again in this language, is essentially vitally important if we're going to get public policy right, if we're going to think about development pathways in a sensible way. We've just got to be realistic about variability and uncertainty out there. So one of the big problems in this world that we work in, and particularly forms of policy, is this reliance on forms of quantification that make assumptions about likelihoods of outcomes. And these are the type of models that are used, for example, in finance, in pandemic epidemiological modelling, in disaster risk prediction, in early warning systems, and. Yeah. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing those. They can be useful bases for having a discussion. But when they're taken into policy and you think that they're the truth, that's when the problems arise. So, and just to be realistic, and most modelers are, the people who actually make these models have a perfectly good understanding of the limitations of them. But those limitations tend to appear in the footnotes or in the endnotes or in the extra additional material. The model is presented as if it is the way to go forward. So let's just not be too. I think one of the big arguments of the books is just be realistic about the limits of knowledge and the non-knowledge that is necessarily out there, and navigating uncertainty is all about that.
Right. I think that's quite important, Ian, also because in my own work and in the work that we've done together and also at IDS, it's really about that many times in these sectors we are beholden to those models, the predictive science and the power of predictive science. But it's also quite difficult to challenge it. And there's something that you mentioned in your book, which is also quite important to highlight in terms of uncertainty, that uncertainty also emerges and is exacerbated by systems of power. Social systems of power, epistemic systems of power, and those hierarchies play out every day, every time, and across those scales. So the book also brings out very nicely the politics of scale, at least in the way I read it, because you are also transcending scales. You're taking a global view of the problems and the challenges, and unfortunately, models also take that aggregate view and get trapped into that risk paradigm. And what you're proposing through your case studies is actually looking at that bottom-up view, looking at what's really happening, and what we understand as risk is really uncertainty, but we are conflating risk and uncertainty. Also, this conflation that happens when science moves to policy is a dangerous one, because we've also found this while working with climate scientists. They are very, very aware of uncertainty, and there are different kinds of uncertainties, even in modeling, the parameters that are chosen for modeling, the kind of models that you need to choose, etc. But somehow the conflation happens when science moves to policy, and policymakers are very averse to the language of uncertainty. And we'll talk about it in a little bit, because I think it's also important before we get into the science policy interface, which is really at the heart of how do we make systems more reliable. I also wanted to find out why there are these different domains, and why have you chosen them? Because you mentioned that these are actually areas of your own work in the course of these years, 40 years. But why did you choose these beyond the fact that these are the areas where you've worked in? Is there a particular reason or a driver?
Well, I think what I wanted to demonstrate across the chapters of the book, and yeah, they are obviously drawing on things that I know about, my own work, but also others, including your own.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, that work that you and Lila and others did in India, I think it was fantastic, and comes in very centrally, as you saw in the climate change chapter. But what I wanted to do is show that actually some of these issues that we've we're talking about the conflation of risk and uncertainty, the power of models, the politics of knowledge that's involved in the debates about the relationship between science and policy and the role of evidence and so on and so forth, all have similarities across cases. And that's what was quite remarkable when I started to think about these in the context of the whole book. So the book, has its first empirical chapter is on finance and banking, and markets more generally. The second one's on critical infrastructures and how we deal with service and supply reliability in infrastructures. The next one is about technology, and I think I've got them the wrong way around. But anyway, the technology one I think came before. But how we think about regulation and safety and so on and so forth. The next one is about pandemics and pandemic preparedness and response. And the last two dovetail with each other a bit. One is about disasters more generally, and the other is particularly about climate change, often interlinked. And indeed the climate change one informs and cross-cuts all the others. But what was interesting when writing it is, and I had an inkling of this already, of course, having worked across these, is that across these cases, very similar dynamics happen. And it is partly because of these structures of power and hierarchy and the politics of knowledge that we've talked about. And this disjuncture between closing down to risk versus opening up to uncertainty, between risk and control versus uncertainty and care, comes across again and again. And I just thought it would be a very useful way for readers to experience a whole array of different sectors, if you like, and think, that's similar. So, I mean, I'm hoping that people who are working in health and pandemics will not just read the pandemics chapter.
Yes. That
they'll read the other chapters too and think, oh, well, there's something, as it were, systemic, there's a pattern here.
Yes.
And it's more general. They may well be aware of the limitations of health systems. Most people are aware of the limitations within their sectors. But actually, the challenges that health sector workers face probably are quite similar to people working in infrastructures in banks and finance and so on. Different in certain ways, and obviously I don't make the case that everything's the same, because of course context matters, history matters, class, gender, intersections of difference matter as the way risks and uncertainties are experienced. But there is an overall pattern there, and I wanted to get that across. And I also wanted to get across the idea that there are actually quite similar responses. It's not only the overall dynamic that's similar, but actually the forms of responses that people have are quite similar. So in each of these sectors we see a particular version of mainstream, standard, modernist, technocratic policy.
Yes.
It has its variations, of course, and its particularities in different sectors and in different regions and different countries and so on. But we also see a remarkable similarity across these in the way that middle-level managers, local people and others are navigating uncertainty and the processes that are essential for that to happen. And these are essentially about the importance of social relations, the importance of networks, the importance of underlying forms of solidarity and connection, and the need to move away from a very sort of individualist, technocratic, top-down version of the world, the sort of modernist view, to a much more plural, much more open, much more diverse set of knowledges that are brought to bear on these challenges. And in all of these settings, a lot of the most successful responses are either unacknowledged or hidden. They're not recognised as part and parcel of what's happening. So it requires research to dig into the processes by which people in banking systems or market systems or people in pandemic response or people in responding to climate change and adapting and mitigating on the ground are doing these things, because they're often not obvious. So that the hopeful lesson of the book is that there's a whole bunch of things happening out there that can confront this, what I call the risk paradigm, with an uncertainty paradigm.
Well, I picked up on the unacknowledged and hidden aspect of these workers or these actors, because this is what, it's sort of a network, a relational, socially embedded process. Also very difficult to see, and not just acknowledged in terms of acknowledged by policymakers, but also very difficult to find out, because it pops out only when you are into that system for a fairly long time.
That's right, yeah.
So in terms of methods, Ian, if we were to find these people, or how would we say policymakers find these people? We find them through our research, your research, my own research is looking at some of these mid-level managers in the context of disasters. And it takes time to find them, because you need long-duration research, which is what your work is also demonstrating, and which has also been my methodological approach. So just in terms of thinking about how, like looking back, because you worked in these sectors and domains for such a long time, you've interacted, engaged with these sectors and actors as well. Is there a way that they can be easily found, so as to say?
Easily is probably unlikely, but I think that there are ways of uncovering this. It's a matter of opening your eyes to what's happening, looking at practice, looking at actually how things unfold, who's involved, why are they involved, how do they make the connections, what happens as a result. And that can emerge through, as you say, long-term ethnographic exploration of these settings. I mean, there's been fantastic work, for example, on banks and finance systems, with embedded anthropology, looking at what happened during and after the financial crash, which I found very inspiring work, because it parallels, again, methodologically and in terms of the broad findings, the sort of work that I have done for years and years and years with small-scale farmers in Zimbabwe and so on, coping with drought and so on. So those sort of ethnographic, in-depth understandings of practice, and and an attentiveness to diverse knowledges and diverse practices, and really trying to understand what happens, not what should happen, but actually what does happen, is important. But I think in revealing some of this, more quickly, or easily, there are some techniques. So we know that these type of it's a relational, social, relational process that we're interested in here. That's what creates reliability, that generates the possibilities of managing and navigating uncertainty. That this is these are networked arrangements. So one of the things we've been experimenting with in a project in northern Kenya with colleagues at the Centre for Research on Drylands and Development is simple network mapping.
Yes.
Asking people to draw a network of the people who are involved in drought response, or even more specifically managing water within a drought, or managing fodder supplies. We're working in pastoral areas with livestock keepers, and doing this several times with men, with women, with youth, triangulating between them with government officials, with NGO people, triangulating between them, convening discussions across these network maps, where you can look at not only the connections between different actors, but also people's rankings and scorings, if you like, of the role of these different actors. And what's incredibly interesting in this work, and it's only evolving now, the team that's working on this is continuing to work on this, is that there are clear patterns that emerge. There are clear sets of people and connections that become important. You can go to the next step and do it in social network analysis and quantify it and all the rest of it, which a PhD student of mine who worked through SPRU, Alex Tasker, did some years ago. very nice work that quantified reliability networks. But you can do it in a more qualitative, open-ended way. And I think often the discussions that emerge in communities around this can then be very practically useful.
Yes.
Because we learn, for example, and it's no surprise to be honest, but a lot of the NGOs, a lot of the governments may have quite a lot of power and resources and may get ranked highly in that respect, but they're not connected to the local network. The local network is managed through a set of relations perhaps connected to, I don't know, a shopkeeper who manages small-scale credit that allows women to gain access to resources to be able to keep their livestock alive, or to people such as sort of soothsayers and people who can predict or claim they can predict. I mean, they are also modelers
Indigenous
of the world, forecasters of and so on and so forth. So you can get quite quickly in those processes to that sort of network. What you then do with that's the next step. But I think that's getting a sense of who the reliability professionals are, who is managing uncertainty or navigating uncertainty. I mean, everyone's navigating uncertainty. So to some extent, everyone in the network is involved in navigating uncertainty. You and I have to navigate uncertainty all the time. But we're not necessarily at the centre of those networks. We're not helping others through knowledge, resources, connections, etc., etc. So that's to some extent who we need to spot if we're going to go the next step to think about how this helps us rethink the top-down, modernist, linear, risk-based paradigm that we're critiquing. Because it's very easy to critique.
Yes.
To be frank. And, many people in the field will critique it. But there are, as you said earlier on, all sorts of institutional, professional power relations that keep people within the risk paradigm.
Yes.
Because that's the accepted way of doing things, even if they know it's rubbish and fails. So I think this exploration that's ongoing now is trying to think about, okay, what are the alternatives? What would a humanitarian agency that's trapped in a top-down delivery model that they know doesn't really work because they evaluated it and people have rejected it, what would they do differently? And I think there are a whole set of questions around capacities, around organisational structures, around finance flows, around resources, and around a sense of professionalism. Who are the professionals?
Yes.
And how do you give new forms of leadership to people who are leaders but actually not recognised as such?
That's so true, Ian, because the reason I asked that question in terms of easily, I was using easily from a very policymaker perspective, right? Because even in my own work, which was on extreme weather events in Western India, what we found is that easily the policymaker will go to the local council or head of the local council, invariably a middle-aged or an elderly man, and then trying to figure out ways in terms of dealing with whatever they want to respond to. In my own work, much similar to yours, I've found that the local dairy and the local market, which is called mandi in the case of India, proved to be the sources of reliability. Mm-hmm. And we also undertook a seasonality approach to see if in every season, and with different kinds of extremes that we were studying, droughts or floods and later on heat waves as well, is the reliability network consistent or not? Mm. And it was in many cases, but there were also differences and gendered differences. Yeah. So there was a reliability network of men in the village who definitely had access to more knowledge. They were the ones who were making decisions. And there was a very hidden network of women as well, and partly more sporadic than more coherent. So consistently we'll see these formal spaces having reliability networks in terms of markets, etc. Yeah. But the one that you pointed out around self-help groups, for instance, these were not as consistent in those settings for various reasons because of patriarchal structures.
Yes, exactly.
But it's also, I think there is an active denial of the presence of these reliability professionals by the power structures that be. And while reading your book, I started thinking about whether risk is like an incumbent power in the book. And, uncertainty is like an emergent power, and there is this friction that is going on because there is uncertainty. We know it. Local people are dealing with it. We are dealing with it, but there is less recognition of the word uncertainty in many ways for various reasons, and also risk has this hold, and because of that hold, it speaks to particular patterns of power, which mirrors social relations of power, be it across age, gender, and other axes of differentiation. But I wanted to move from that discussion into something that you started talking about. So your book is about navigating uncertainty, but it's also making a very strong argument about reliability. So there are these two key words or terms that you are actually developing in the book. So there are these types of uncertainties in these domains. So it's conflated as risk. This is what risk looks like. And these are the reliability professionals that we have come across in the field. They may be mostly at the local scale in this book, but highly networked in many ways and responding to the uncertainties that they are facing. I wanted you to talk a little bit about reliability as a term for listeners, because for many of them, it may be new in the way the book has used it, what reliability means. And how do we leverage reliability and how it is leveraged by these actors? And what are some of the most fundamental attributes of reliability, as it were?
Okay, that's a big set of questions. But
mainly about reliability.
No, for sure. No, because it is a really key term, and it's one that we've been developing, and you've been developing, I know, and we've been drawing on the work of Emery Rowe and others based in Berkeley. And they've been looking at so-called critical infrastructures. So critical infrastructures are defined as the infrastructures that provide essential goods and services. And the key challenge for people managing critical infrastructures, and that may be water supply or electricity supply, Emery and Co. looked at electricity supply in California, is to have a relatively stable set of goods and services in the context of a highly variable input environment.
Yes.
And what's interesting, of course, and Emery's work in both pastoral systems and in electricity systems in California, is that there are, not surprisingly, some parallels here. What you find in many settings that you and I work in is the high levels of input variability emerge from droughts, floods, extreme events, and so on. And increasingly that is the world we live in, because climate change is not necessarily affecting overall averages of rainfall and so on, heat. It's creating more extremes, more variability.
More volatility, as you also mentioned.
So the real challenge is, how do you transfer that high level of variability to a reasonably stable set of outputs that keep the lights on in California, or, as it says in the book, keep the herds alive in Kenya. So in between those, that's where the reliability professionals and the modes of operation that these type of professionals need to do happen. And one of the challenges of research is to not only identify the people, but actually the practices associated with it. Is it about providing funds? Is it about providing knowledge? Is it about providing connection and networks? And usually we find, as you said, it's a whole combination of those, and they're different depending on the form of variability, its seasonality, but also how different people face variability, because variability is faced obviously very differently by very different people. It's gendered, it's different across age, it depends on how much wealth you have, and so on and so forth. I mean, heat extremes can be managed by turning on an air conditioner if you've got loads of money and you live in a big urban setting where there's a reliable electricity supply or whatever. That's not possible for many other people, and heat extremes then become a source of vulnerability. So we have to contextualize this. It's not just a simple engineering model about how to transfer high variability to low variability. it's actually socially, historically contextualized, and often the challenges that people face are due to long historical imprints of colonialism, of discrimination, of forms of structural vulnerability that are caused by the violences that, if you like, have come from long histories. So we have to bear that in mind. But yeah, reliability is essentially that process by which we generate some level of stability, because the book doesn't. It was an interesting discussion yesterday at the launch. You know, the book doesn't say, "Oh, uncertainty is great."
Yes.
You know, because actually uncertainty is not great for a lot of people, because it causes stress, it causes anxiety, it causes all sorts of vulnerabilities in just straight material terms.
Yes.
So, but the point is not to ignore it and blanket and pretend it doesn't exist, because it is being experienced, and it's particularly being experienced by people who don't have the resources, the capacities, etc., to create stability in ways that are easily done. So, you know, people in conflict situations, people in highly vulnerable settings that are exposed to the effects of climate change, etc., etc., etc. So, you know, in development studies, we're particularly interested in that context, but we have to contrast it. And again, you know, this is an argument that is not just about development, about marginalised people in marginalised places. It's about that, but the book is also about something more general, because this applies everywhere, but we have to understand it. The important thing about reliability and the distinction with uncertainty is a product of knowledge. I explained the definitions before.
Yes.
And it's, in my understanding, and other people would call it epistemic uncertainty, but in the definition that I use, following Andy Sterling's work, it's about the lack of knowledge about the likelihoods of outcomes. So it's really about knowledge. It's about a state of knowledge, not a state of nature. Variability is a state of nature. It's the variability, and some people would call that aleatoric.
Yes.
It's a word that I can never pronounce, so I don't tend to use it. Would call that aleatoric uncertainty. But reliability deals with variability, but it has also to deal with the knowledge relations that variability generates. And that's where I think this uncertainty perspective builds on the work of Emery and others to highlight in particular the politics of knowledge that arises in this process. So I don't know whether that's enough on reliability, but you know, there's great work out there, and again it connects very different contexts, and I think it provides a really exciting starting point for thinking about how to refashion systems in very different ways, prioritizing different types of things that conventionally development policy has just simply ignored.
I think it's amazing, Ian. I know I've been using that word quite often now, but it's brilliant. Also in the terms of, it's so accessible, the stories that you've told, the real people and places, and I think there's a connect there. But I also like the point that you made just now about knowledge relations, variability, and its connection with reliability, because that can be easily overlooked. Mm-hmm. And it's really important to get to the heart of that problem, and that is what the chapters are so beautifully illustrating. Like, in what terms the uncertainty is getting created.
Exactly.
Who is experiencing it? It's not same for everybody, but then there are patterns. And also the fact that, despite the fact that we are not romanticizing uncertainty, no one wants to glorify uncertainty, but uncertainty is also a fact of life, which is something that you say in the book. It's not like there will be, even if we go into so-called stable environments, I don't think there is any environment that is stable. There'll always be uncertainty. There are limits to what we can know. And I think that is what your book is saying. We cannot know it all. Knowledge is situated. And in those kinds of scenarios, what should we do? Should we just hold on to one form of knowledge and create the protocols and solutions? Or should we look at diverse forms of knowledges and practices and then build forward from there towards a more emancipatory politics, which is more iterative and deliberative?
Exactly. No, I mean, I start with a quote from Helga Novotny's book
Yes.
on, uncertainty is written into the script of life, which is a quote I love, because it really is absolutely at the centre of the everyday experience of most people.
Yes.
And that's what the book, I hope, tries to do, with lots of case studies and lots of, interviews and quotes from different people, to show that script of life is real lived experience.
And I think that is, I agree with you, and that is what is so truly powerful about the book. So even when I read the particular chapters, I actually thought it is the script of life in a way, because you are connecting with people who are in different parts of the world. What is common between a herder in Kenya or an islander living in the Sundarbans and a banker somewhere in the global north? It is the fact that they all face uncertainties, but in different ways, and the resources that they marshal in order to respond to it, and the relations that they bring in. I think that is the difference, but it does show that uncertainty is a great leveler many a time.
It is, and I mentioned the subtitle of our ERC project, Global Lessons from the Margins.
Yes.
Because I think actually learning lessons from the margins, in this case, margins as seen from the centre, from the metropolitan centres of power, where we sit, basically, is really crucial, because actually they reveal the herder in Kenya, the Delta dweller in the Sundarbans, the small-scale farmer in Zimbabwe. They reveal what's possible. And actually the power relations and the forms of justification, the narrowing down, the sort of modernist technocracy, if you like, that is situated around banking, for example, or finance systems, often keeps that so opaque. And so actually making those connections with lessons from the margins, learning from the global south, broadly understood, and bringing some of those lessons into the heart of capitalist global north, banking in New York or London or Frankfurt or wherever, I think it's quite powerful. I mean, it's powerful rhetorically, but it's, I think, genuinely powerful, because actually there is some kind of commonality in human experience, particularly human experience at this moment. And it's not to say that, people past, there are sections in the book where we look at, the historical experiences of uncertainty. And, it's not to say that now is more uncertain than was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Probably that's not the point. The point is, I think today, the blinkers that have been put on us by a history of particular type of individualistic modernism, if you like, a sort of linear version of the acceptable way of progress, whether in the West or in communist countries and so on. I mean, there are remarkable similarities. I had a book launch in China recently, in Beijing, and the conversations there were interesting in the sense that there were parallels. So there are different ways of closing down to risk. It may be state-imposed, it may be through the neoliberal architecture of financial systems. It may be through technocracy and the role of elite expertise. There are different ways that happens, but all of that happens particularly in certain settings. But to break free from that, decolonize, if you like to use the term, to reimagine, is what this book is about. And I think by learning lessons across those settings, it becomes more powerful as a result.
Yes, and more relatable.
Yeah.
In many ways. Throughout your book, and in conclusions of each of the chapters, you tend to send out this powerful message that we need to open up to uncertainty. We need to recognize uncertainty, acknowledge that it's there, which is what we've been talking about, and also embrace it, right? And we've talked about it, But the top-down modernist protocol examples, policymakers, decision makers, we come across are very averse to the word uncertainty in itself. One, that they conflate uncertainty with risk, that's without knowing what is uncertainty and what is risk. But they are also very averse to using the term uncertainty. So for the work that I do, which is mainly with bureaucrats, when I interview policymakers, they are very reticent and quite defensive when you talk about uncertainty. And one of the bureaucrats in India whom I'd interviewed years ago, in 2018 probably, said that please don't talk about uncertainty. We cannot use this language because I can't make a decision saying this is uncertain, I do not know, so I will do this. So this is the kind of predictive power of risk that people want to hold on to, right? And I'm wondering now that the book alludes to the possibilities of hope, that there is hope. But how do we make it a reality? How do we move from the bottom up? Because these are islands of opportunities in many ways, which you're trying to connect in. But your book also makes the case for systemic changes.
Yeah.
And how do we get to that point of systemic changes? What kind of changes are required? Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, the subtitle, as we discussed before, is called Radical Rethinking, and anything radical is difficult.
Yes.
And challenging to the status quo and the power relations that support the status quo. I mean, I agree with you that policymakers are reticent about embracing uncertainty for all the reasons you described. But this isn't necessarily the case. I mean, there's a nice example in the technology chapter around GM crops and the UK debate, where different ministers with rather different backgrounds, rather different sets of expertise, rather different positionalities vis-a-vis the topic of GM crops, had very different responses to evidence. And the ones who were able to grasp uncertainty had experienced other uncertain situations. And I'm thinking here, and the example is of Mo Mowlam, who was a Labour minister at that time. His previous job before being cabinet minister was in Northern Ireland. Well, if Northern Ireland at that time was a seriously uncertain setting if you were a minister in the British government, negotiating the Good Friday Agreement. But I think she developed that capacity to be more humble, less hubristic, more open, more reflexive, more able to think outside the box in ways that many, certainly indeed in her own cabinet, including the Prime Minister Tony Blair and his Science Minister David Sainsbury, at that time. And I think that was significant in that. I mean, this is a very small little example of a particular moment. But I think we shouldn't paint all policymakers with the same brush. And I think we should allow the opportunity of policymakers to open up to uncertainty, to recognise that actually accepting that knowledge is uncertain, that the evidence isn't secure, that the data that is being provided by civil servants or whoever onto their desk has large error bars associated with it, needs to be part of the type of decision making that has to be there as part of thinking about multiple pathways, multiple sources of knowledge, and multiple ways forward. Because if you don't, experienced policymakers know this well, you get in trouble. People react to that decision. You may be able to make a decision, but you may make it in haste, you may make it without necessarily forms of deliberation and so on. And I think what uncertainty does, the shift from risk to uncertainty, is to shift us from a style of decision making that is essentially expert driven, cost benefit analysis, risk assessment, etc., etc. There's, this side of the spreadsheet has this number, the other side of the spreadsheet has that number, therefore you choose that. To saying, actually, we've got to have a debate about this, and politicians and policymakers need to be much better at convening debate convening forms of deliberation. There may have to be a decision at some point, but actually to open it up to that form of deliberation, open up to a more democratic form of thinking about challenging problems, whether that's about technology and GM crops, or whether it's about how to respond to climate change or how to deal with a pandemic. Doing that in a way that's more open, usually, I would say, results in better decisions, or more sustained decisions that don't have the risk I'm using, of collateral effects, of damaging effects. So I think we need to reframe our way of thinking about policy, and that needs to bring in these ideas about deliberation, these ideas about opening up to diverse forms of knowledge, but it also means breaking the hold of particular ways of thinking that dominate policy. So there's a section in one of the chapters on economics. Economics is a fantastic discipline. I studied it in my past. But over time, it's narrowed and narrowed and narrowed to a particular style of neoclassical economics that has a very quantitative focus that is, very much in the risk paradigm, if you like. But actually there's a long tradition of economics, and in development studies there certainly is a long tradition of economics that embraces uncertainty. You only have to think of John Maynard Keynes and Alfred Shackle and Albert Hirschman, for example, who were all celebrated economists in their time and very influential in policy, who knew that uncertainty was absolutely central to the economic policy challenge. I think that thinking has been lost. And whether it's economics or in the natural sciences and the engineering or sciences or whatever, we need to bring back some of that stuff that was there in the past, where uncertainty was much more accepted as part and parcel of the way we think about problems. And that also then, what follows from that is that we need new forms of capability and capacity amongst people. So we sit in an Institute of Development Studies. We're supposed to be training the next generation people who do development, whatever that might be. People who go out into policy, who go out into the UN system, who go out into the NGO sector or wherever. I would hope that institutes like IDS would be teaching that next generation to think in this way, to think about complexity, to think about uncertainty, and not train people in the certainties of a modernist vision. Now, I don't know enough about the curriculum at IDS to judge, but my sense is that more generally, and I'm not talking about IDS now, but more generally, we don't do that. We don't do that enough. The type of training that we offer the next generation of people who come into these positions is not the type of training that's fit for purpose, quite frankly. So I think there's a whole set of challenges out there, starting at curriculum redesign to the sort of wider training, capacity development and so on. And that relates to the point that we've already spoken about, is that there's a lot of capacity out there already. There are plenty of people we can learn about. We're not having to do this from scratch. This isn't a textbook job. This is about actually making sure that people learn from these reliability professionals and the people who are navigating uncertainty successfully in different sectors and across different sectors in ways that can help people in the future. So lots of cross-learning, I think, and that's partly, one of the incentives, we talked about this before, of having such diverse sectors and cases.
Yes.
I think there can be lots of cross-learning across these cases, and I think there's a whole opportunity out there for training courses and capability building and so on and so forth. And finally, what follows from this is some really quite fundamental rethinking of organisations and how organisations are structured, how organisations are thought about, and how hierarchies in organizations exist, and how we accept and enhance and recognize all these people in complex organizations who are doing all this stuff already.
Yes.
That are hidden, that are under-acknowledged, that are
under the radar.
Just often completely under the radar.
Yes.
And rather than designing our organizations from the top down in a sort of formulaic way that, may suit an HR department, we have to rethink, what does this organization want to deliver? Does it want to deliver reliability and resilience that's able, and processes that are able to navigate uncertainty, where you don't build a classic hierarchical organization? So, if you're going to reform the United Nations, or you're going to reform the international NGO sector, or you're going to reform aid agencies, that's where you've got to start. And you've got to start from, what are we trying to do, and is that delivering these type of capacities that we've been talking about? And currently, it doesn't.
That are needed for the kind of challenges we face now.
Absolutely.
So clearly, a lot of institutions, including our curriculum, educational curriculum, and what we are producing in the development sector and beyond, is not fit for purpose.
No.
And
that's why we've got to have radical rethinking. And radical rethinking that's practical, that is hopefully useful. And I hope the book, people read the book and think, yeah, okay, I can do something. I can't do everything, but I can do something. And I can learn from another situation, another sector. I can begin to refashion the way we do things, because if we don't, we're not going to be able to navigate an uncertain and turbulent world.
Thank you, Ian. I think you're absolutely, absolutely right. But the book does that job. It does offer possibilities, and I hope that the readers will pick up on those possibilities, both opportunities and challenges, and recognize and acknowledge the uncertainties that we are facing today, as well as what we're about to face in future. So it's not that uncertainties, as you said, uncertainties were in the past, they're today, they'll be tomorrow. But if we don't recognize them, I think we are going to be talking about risk for a long time, and not actually achieve the kind of outcomes that we seek to achieve in terms of the people that we are working with, especially people on the front line, who are actually bearing the brunt of not recognizing uncertainties in many ways. So with that, I'm going to stop. And I hope that the audience will download, order, and read this very, very important and timely book. Personally, it's been an inspiration for my work, which you already know, and it'll continue to inspire my work in years to come. And I hope it does that for many others who are listening to this podcast and will listen to this podcast in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Shilpi. Been a great conversation.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for listening. Please like, subscribe, and share to help us spread the word. Do you have a feature that you would like to appear in a future episode? If so, then email betweenthelines@ids.ac.uk.